And we are back for another episode of the Artisans of the Horizon. I have today with me Jonathan Foster, a graduate of Northwind Seminary, rather, where I graduated from as well. And Jonathan, will you share a little bit with the folks about who you are and how you present yourself in the world?
Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate that. Yeah, I am. Who am I? I'm an author, former church planner, pastor. Um, yeah, thanks for the reminder. I did graduate. I do have some degrees, so that's good. Um, I am the father of three, the partner of one. I have a new granddaughter. She's 3 months old. That is a lot of fun. I like art. I love to hike, and get out in the mountains. And that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
That's awesome. Our our connection comes through Tom Ord, who seems to know a lot of people in the theology world. And Tom is familiar to our viewers because he has been on this show, oh, probably more than anybody. For almost every one of his books that he publishes, he comes on to talk about it. Um,
Nice.
and he's a good buddy of mine. And so he connected the two of us. And before we get into our dialogue about your book and some of the research you've done and all the really wonderful ways that you show up in the world, our viewers know that this conversation show or series really began out of this idea of creating a sacred space where we can have dialogues around what is the world going to look like beyond the one that we currently have, beyond that horizon. And I know a lot of people who are doing amazing things. So I thought, well, this would be a great place to bring people forward to share what's happening
Mhm.
in the world. What are they doing? What are they crafting, creating? Partly because we know from science that our eye has the ability to see much further than our brain can actually comprehend. So when we are constantly going through our life, for those of us who can see, when we are looking at something, we're actually looking much further than we realize, but our
Mm.
brain has a limit to how much data it can process. So we try to manifest that world that we are seeing by using our gifts and talents in varying ways uh, to bring into our awareness that world that we do not actually see yet. So, knowing that, tell me a little bit about how you do that in your day to day life. How do you craft or paint or imagine the world that's just beyond our horizon?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful way of viewing it and setting it up. And I don't know that I maybe have read that or heard of that about that. Like the eye sees more than the brain can take in. But yeah, that seems to make sense. And so we're always constantly, prefrontal cortex telling ourselves stories about what it is we're seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, what we're experiencing, and trying to make meaning out of it, right? And I'm no exception. I've been trying to make meaning my whole life in different kinds of ways. Those meaning making paradigms that I've used have shifted dramatically over the years for lots of different reasons. Some of it's just growth and evolution, and that's just the way reality is. Some of it's because I've experienced a lot of loss in my life. So that heavy amount of subtraction in a very kind of like addition obsessed world and addition obsessed, really even church world that I live in, all of that subtraction invited me to reapproach and rethink love and God and life and art and loss and kind of like what I'm up to and what who God might be. It's been a very interesting, not easy, but incredibly interesting life. And so, yeah, I'm constantly trying to approach it in artistic ways. I think to answer your question more specifically, like for me, the way I try to create those things that I cannot see or the things I see and that I don't quite understand yet is to I've just been trying to filter everything through an idea of love, through a lens of love. When I was making meaning most of my life, it was through a pretty typical American Christianity kind of version, that placed a lot of emphasis on love, but frankly, when it came time to kind of define love, it was pretty anemic in the way the definitions were offered up, and it usually wound up being some kind of like old, tired, sacrificial kind of idea that God needed certain kinds of things to happen in order for love to be dispensed. And so I finally decided, if I'm going to really try to get what I think my best take is on this ancient text called the Bible, not only that, try to get my best take on what it is to live life, I kind of needed to have, I mean, I don't really love the idea of like an ultimate source, but I kind of needed to have an ultimate. And for me, that was love. And so, yeah, I think one way to define it is the last several years, I've just been trying to approach and reapproach love. It's been super, super challenging and very interesting at the same time.
I love that. And it's interesting that you say that, because I hear Tom say that all the time. And
Mhm.
so I'm sure he's influenced some of that, in your own life as well. And that he always says, I'm just trying to, practice love. I like how you say that you approach love, and then you've also come back to love at different points, and what's really nice about that too is I think of like presiding Bishop Michael Curry in the Episcopal Church. He became famous as the preacher who talked about love all the time. And
Mhm.
one of the things I liked about his ministry, Tom's writing, your work, is it has really helped a lot of folks put more meat onto that very bare bones word of love. It's really shown that love is more complicated, it's more
Right,
complex, it requires much more of us than we
right,
oftentimes are told it requires. Um, and it can make or break relationships of all kinds, particularly in denominations. I know in my own past denominational history, wanting to love a certain way, or certain types of people was oftentimes the time when the church threw in the towel and was like, no, I'm done with you. I can't do that.
mhm,
And so I think people who force us to really sit with love, in the sense of that love is demanding and requires something of us, is really good for the body of Christ and for people in general.
yeah, I think it's worthy of our best intellect and wrestling, and trying to stay present to it, and stay open to, wherever it's going. It's not a static thing. I'm committed to this idea of a relational cosmos. I think everything is entangled, interconnected, related, and because of that, everything is in a bit of a flux. So it's not a religion of certainty that I'm trying to pursue. And I get that for some people that kind of freaks them out, because again, that's not really what American consumer religion is about. It is about more about certainty. But when I take love seriously, it helps me to engage and interact in that relational thing, because no matter how crazy things get, what I think is that love is always, always present in the middle of all of it, maybe sometimes breaking open, and in that wounding, even hurting, and all that change and transition. It's irrepressible, it's indefatigable, there's something really, really interesting about it. And so I totally agree with you. And I'll just say too, I agree with your thoughts about Tom. I'm glad he's been on a lot. He's been a big influence on me. And one of the things that Tom does as well as anyone I've ever met is he does give us definitions. He does give us stuff to latch on to. I know in my dissertational work, which was with him, when I finished that up a year or two ago, yeah, I built a lot of my thinking around his stuff. Not the least of which was his definition of love, which is basically, this energy that's in relationship with God and others, that's meant for flourishing. I said that in the wrong order, but that's basically the idea. And I just co-opt that and use it all the time. And I sometimes throw in, depending on, if we're talking about some of my work, I'll try to throw in which is to say, talking about Rene Girard's work. So I'll throw in scapegoating. So I'll maybe say that love is this non-scapegoating energy in relationship with God and others that's, there for the benefit and flourishing of everyone, for the good of everyone. So yeah, these definitions are super important, and I think love is a really important topic.
Well, in the last 4 years, as I've done this show, I have noticed that a lot of people who come onto this show, one of the common principles of being an artisan of the horizon is a claiming of the world that's happening around us, and claiming specifically responsibility. Not in a sense of having to come in and save the world or come in and correct the world, but taking a responsibility that says, I'm going to show up, be accounted for, and throw my lot into the ring so that I can have a response to what's happening right now, not for the sake of responding, but for the sake of being a part of this mix. I think that, as you have mentioned, I think the cosmos is inherently relational. It requires something of us, and we have to be hands-on. We have to be engaged. But I also think that this means that we need to question, how do we engage? Who do we engage with? What are the ramifications of that? What are the consequences of loving and being a loving person? And ultimately, it comes down to, what is it that we're consenting to? What is the radical yes that we are giving to the world? And you explore that in your book on the theology of consent, your dissertation that you did with Tom. And you look at it from different vantage points. And can you speak a little bit about this idea of having a radical yes to life, consenting to the world that's in front of us, and how does that relate to God?
Yeah, that's a big question. I spent a couple years trying to wrestle with all of that. And frankly, still am trying to wrestle with all of it. Once you get stuff into book form, you think you're going to have it all figured out, and it's there forever. It turns out you're constantly working on it in one way or another. But yeah, theology of consent, the subtitle is Mimetic Theory in an Open and Relational Universe, which it started out as kind of like my take on how Rene Girard's mimetic theory is wired, and then my take on how open and relational theology is wired, and then it's me crossing the wires and watching the smoke and the sparks fly. And I didn't set out with this idea of consent. It was kind of in the back of my mind, but even that word, it's not a word I used a ton over the years, because my framing and my conditioning is more of this, top-down hierarchical I call it capital O, omnipotent. I like Catherine Keller. She calls it the omni-macho God. It's always masculine. It's always, top of the pyramid, because for a lot of different reasons that we can get into, we just bought into the idea over the years that this power, this force, like, that's the only way to think of power, is through this physical, masculine, top-down dominating kind of force. And all of that, was running counter against. It's weird. Kind of like growing up, I heard about that, but I also saw some of the very same people who would talk in that kind of language demonstrate really beautiful acts of service and of love that clearly weren't based on, this some power, omnipotent kind of God, but was based on something else. And so those things were always kind of in conflict. And what has happened over the last few years, and in part what happened with theology of consent, my book is me, finally kind of reconciling that and figuring out what that is. And essentially, it can be explained a lot of different ways, but the consent piece speaks to the fact that I just don't think God is interested in controlling us or forcing us or coercing. And just like a good parent does not need to raise their kid up to be codependent. Now, obviously, when the kid is younger, there are things that you do you're maybe more proactive and engaged, even physically at times, to keep them safe. But the goal is, the movement, the trajectory is you're going somewhere with it. And the goal is not for them to be codependent the rest of their lives, but to become fully experiencing and decision making, empowered, full of agency, kind of creatures. And I think that's all because of love. And I think if that's the way a parent is, how much more our heavenly parent, if we want to characterize God as in that way. And so consent becomes a really big piece, like this whole consensual thing. And I know I'll just say one other thing, and then we can talk more about it or whatever you want. But I know I was really arrested by the thought a few years ago, and I know I'm not the first, but arrested by the thought of Mary and her just little sentence when she says, "Let it be," let it be unto me, as you've said, or whatever the translation or the paraphrase is. And also how terrible it would have been if that had not been recorded. In other words, if God had just stepped in and done whatever he had wanted to Mary, it was unthinkable. It is unthinkable to imagine a God of love forcing himself upon someone. So I remember sitting with that one afternoon, and by one afternoon, I mean 1 week or 1 month or one season of my life, and thinking, oh God, maybe the whole universe revolves around consent. Like maybe at some level, the smallest subatomic particles, obviously they don't have a will and an agency in the same way that a squirrel has or you and I have. Not that I'm that much different than a squirrel, but obviously don't have the same agency. But there is something to be said for the way that subatomic particles experience and react to things, and atoms react, and aggregates of atoms react. And so I was like, man, when you sit with this for a while, maybe love is the thing that's inviting everything to move forward. And the way it moves forward is, our response really to that love. And then the interactive response of that love then back, the counter move that then God makes, not against us, but with us, co-creating with us, like an artist, would co-create. And so the consensual piece, yeah, all of that, it all just kind of grew from there. And I saw the common denominators between Rene Girard's Mimetic Theory and open and relational theology.
Well, I like that you bring up Mary, because that's one of the areas where I don't know, I guess I hold a controversial opinion, and I'm not the only one, but I'm not totally clear or certain that Mary's fiat, her yes, it was indeed consensual, and I hold that tension theologically because I want us to grapple with this
Right.
whole notion of, how do we interplay with this cosmic story?
Mm-hmm.
I bring it sometimes, and actually, I mentioned it in my last conversation with Tom, that I sometimes wonder in our conversations around Eucharist and around whether or not the bread and wine become Jesus, or bread and wine, but somehow resemble Jesus, or whatever your take on that topic
Right.
is.
Right.
I've often said, well, I don't know either way, because I don't know how fully the bread and wine have consented to being made into Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
What does the space between two atoms have to say about this idea about God, about being made into Jesus, or being made into
Mm-hmm.
something else, or being bred? What is the consciousness of these other beingness? Meister Eckhart said that isness is God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this question of consent, one, requires us to wonder and interrogate whether or not we have a radical yes to the universe, to the life that's unfolding right under our nose. But also, is life consenting and giving a radical yes to us? And if not, what does that mean for us? How do we navigate that? How do we move towards that world that's just beyond the horizon. So it makes relationships, it makes denominations really very insecure.
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of things a little bit insecure for sure. And I think it's a really important concept. And by the way, you might be right. It might be that um, the story with Mary is about a God who is not as interested in that, because there is a way to read that sacred text, not only that story, but the whole thing, in a way that doesn't esteem the consensual nature of love. I personally think it is an unhealthy way to read it, and I would encourage people to do that. But also, if your commitment is, oh no, God's going to force His way, I just think, well, in that case, the sacred text is wrong, because my lived experience of love, like I literally have no other way to conceive of love in terms of the way I've interacted with my partner now of going on 34 years, dating 4 years before that. So she and I have been together almost 38 years. I have no other way to conceive of love as I think about my relationship with my beautiful parents, who were also very complicated and interesting, siblings, but my kids, especially being a dad. Like at the end of the day, I just don't need to force them to do anything in order to gain any kind of acceptance or love or grace or mercy or goodness, whatever that synonym would be. Now, of course, I mean, there are ramifications, there are implications based on maybe choices that they would make, but there is no chance that they would ever cause me to stop loving them. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, and I hear what you're saying. Like I think it's really important to keep the tension of that in play, because then it kind of keeps us on our toes, so to speak, and it keeps us really engaged with this thing, which I think is important.
Well, I also to add to that in the sense of, I think this tension, learning to live with this tension, allows us to have some friction by which we can create something. We can initiate a
Right,
spark, right, for
right.
something that is life giving. And um, it also requires us to say that even with the uncomfortable, the provocative, the disturbing, we can still work with that to find something holy, something meaningful, something
Mhm,
life-giving, whatever you
mhm,
want to call it, whatever adjective you want to call it,
mhm,
which presupposes the idea that everything has within it a spark of the divine, to use a Quaker phrase, right? Everything is useful, and everything's a tool, but also a medicine. And
mhm.
how do you feel like in your experience, post the dissertation and the publication of the book, how has this really influenced your day-to-day life? I know that you have mentioned about having to grapple with loss and tragedy, something I feel like all of us collectively can relate to, especially living in this world of COVID and other global health issues. Uh, how do we face that? How do we consent to that? Um, I oftentimes go through my day asking God, well, where is the good news in all of this? Where is the good news in this? Where's the resurrection in all of this, right?
I
Um,
often I often go through the day and feel like God is asking me that.
hmm, say more about it.
Well, that has been one way that it has kind of transitioned on me over the last, and in me, not just on me, but within me over the last several years. It's less of God as the answer and more of God as the question, inviting me to come up with the answers to that. And so I do pray way more that way. My frame of mind is, I think it's possible that the divine is interacting with me in such a way that the divine is asking me, where is the resurrection in this? Jonathan, where is the good news? How can you help me? And how can I help you discover this together? So that's definitely been revolutionary for me.
One of my favorite chapters in your book is the about instability as the new stability.
Mm.
And I like it because I like this idea of having to, again, have a radical yes to the life that's unfolding before you. Um, because showing up and getting dirty and that all of that um, is really what helps us to move forward into the world that is just around the horizon. And it requires us to say, I have a lot more here than I realize. I have a lot more resiliency in this experience than I realize, but I have to face up to it. And you talked about, and I've already mentioned it before, the whole idea of scapegoating and how that is oftentimes what is done in our society at large, our global human family, but as well as our ecclesiastical systems. We do this often in church where we scapegoat, so like, well, you know, it's those damn gays. they
Yeah.
they're causing all this trouble because they're forcing us to have to think, well, maybe we're not actually being as loving as we think we are, or
Right.
maybe love can manifest in patterns that are not familiar to our own or not similar to our own. Or it's women having to force us to recognize different forms of leadership in our churches. And a
Mhm.
lot of churches are willing to just throw those aside and be like, no, we're not going to grapple with that. In your own denomination, the Church of the Nazarene, Tom is really pushing, and as well as other people, for queer affirmation and grappling uh, with the church's stance on this topic. So I wonder about that in the sense of how has this kind of really helped you in navigating your own instability, rather, in your day-to-day life, and uh, has it made you resentful towards God? Has it made you more encouraged?
Well, I mean, you just touched upon a lot of things. So I used to be a part of the Church of the Nazarene. Nazarenes officially invited me to surrender my credentials a few years ago over my changing theological posture. It really, at its depth, it was about the very things that we're talking about my commitment to move forward in love and my renunciation of a worship of the certitude and certainty in certain dogmatic ideological things. The flashpoint was around LGBTQ stuff because that's the easy thing for the powers that be to kind of rally around. It's the easiest for them to gain unity with other people because there's the most confusion around that topic, and because, well, frankly, I think many religious humans, and maybe all humans, irreligious too, just kind of get freaked out about sex and sexuality, and we just haven't taught ourselves well to kind of hold some of the tension that arises. So yeah, instability is the new stability. Some of that speaks to even what you were saying earlier, like the tension, instability, and all of that. So a part of my work has been trying to figure out, first of all, I should say all my work really kind of up until this point has been me pulling at the thread, trying to figure it out. I mean, I really haven't, I mean, I've written 5, 6, 7 books now, and I remember none of them have I sat down and wrote because I have this great information I need to share with the world, but rather I've just I've just been so freaking curious about why this is, and sometimes curious slash hurt and wounded by what has happened, that I'm just or pissed off. It's been a combination of all those things. Like what the expletive is going on here? What is really happening? Um, but yeah, a lot of my work has now been around this instability piece of trying to determine, like, the tension, the instability. Is that because God needs it to be that way? Or is that because there are other things that have introduced themselves in such a way that it's really kind of messed things up? I tend to, it's probably a little both, but I tend to think it's the latter because I'm committed to this idea of a God of love that doesn't force and coerce. So this is a God who's so creative that he or she does not need to author evil, does not need to author the pain, but but is so omnipresent and so omni with us that is right there available in the breaking open of the pain. And like it's a fine line, but it's at least up until now, it's been really important to me. Um, but it has put me in a position of instability, and um, then it's caused me to ask, well, how have we done things in the past? Why have we gotten here, and how can we move forward in the future? And that then kind of sets up the mimetic theory scapegoating piece, and we can talk about that if you want, but I guess I needed to say that those other words first.
Yeah, I mean, and it brings into the whole conversation as well, this whole idea around how far are we willing to go with our discipleship.
Mm.
I think for a lot of church folks and just folks in general, it's really scary to travel down roads that are not well lit, right?
Yeah.
I feel like in the church, we have been trained to think of discipleship as a field trip where everything is predetermined in the itinerary. We have chaperones who are the experts who are supposed to keep us safe as we are on this little trip. And it's all pre-curated and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, I have found that discipleship is much more about adventure. There's inherent risk taking.
Yep.
There is the real potential for hurt. And if you get hurt, what do you do about it? How do you treat it? You know, and what happens when it's a hurt that forever transforms you? You know, whether because you walk with a limp, so to speak, you know, or you have some type of injury that completely shifts your consciousness. You know, I used to work before I was ordained, doing community organizing and working a lot on foreign and foreign policy issues, particularly issues of war and peace. And I interacted a lot with veterans who would fight in different wars or battle zones and then come back and have a completely different mind about what that life was for them. Some of them ended up becoming radical pacifists and engaged in anti-war demonstrations and all that kind of stuff. Some came back just disillusioned with the whole idea of this type of relating with people of power over, right? And inflicting our systems upon other people as a weapon. And one of the things that I really learned coming out of that experience was the whole idea of moral injury, right? And how is it that we do certain things that cause our soul to be wounded, not just our bodies, but our souls to be wounded? How do we grapple with that? And this is where I feel like in my own life, the church has often failed because as a queer person, person of color, person with differing physical and mental abilities, you know, these are all things that the church was like, I'm willing to go this far with you, but all this other stuff, I can't deal with it. I'm just Pilate. I'm gonna wash my hands of it. And then the church abandons you, right? And that wounds your soul on a deep level to the point where it begins to require you to say, well, how am I coming, you know, showing up to this experience? You know, how do I grapple with this? And so anyway, all of that being said, I think it comes back to this idea of God is consenting to us in every moment because God is constantly wooing us into a love affair. But where is our yes in the conversation, right? Where is our yes in the process? And how do we as church people accompany folks in that discernment?
Yeah, it's a really big question, important question, and I don't disagree with you. I think by and large, the story, at least of in the West of Christianity, has been it's a conditional kind of grace. And after a while, you start to realize conditional grace is no grace at all. It's either unconditional or it's not grace. So it's deeply troubling and unfortunate, what has happened, and the way we've ordered our machinery, the mechanism around all of that. And interestingly, good things have come out of it. There are some ways, because of our systematized ways that we've been thinking over the centuries. There's some civilization has grown out of it, and so that's that's complicated and interesting. But it has, at what price, at what cost? It has left a lot of people, and continues to continually leave droves and droves of people on the side of the road. And it's shocking. Once, like for me, getting jettisoned out of the system, sounds like maybe you've been jettisoned out of certain religious systems maybe longer than me. But once I really officially got jettisoned out, which would have been 2019 officially, so the last 5 years, it's just been shocking, the amount of people that are still like really good, beautiful people, really interested in Jesus, really interested in like substantive, interesting, creative things around love and grace and mercy and endurance and long suffering and patience and all these things, who just don't have a home, or who, the system has been so willing to kick out. That's not to scapegoat the entire system, because again, there's some good things that have happened, but it is shocking how, willfully ignorant many people are in the middle of it. And I do think a lot of it has to do with what you're touching upon, is how do we help those people, excuse me, lean into the adventure of this thing versus like the prefabricated way this is all supposed to go. That's really just, it's fabricated in a way to keep us safe and isolated and not be hurt, and which has nothing to do with it. Really, it has nothing to do with discipleship or Jesus, or certainly has anything to do with love. Because if there's no risk, there is no love. Love is not love without the risk to do so, without the ability of the beloved to turn their back and walk away. So, and if that is the fundamental nature, if we live in a relational cosmos, and at the heart of that relational cosmos is consent, holy cow, that means risk. It is literally unrealistic to think in terms of getting rid of risk. So yeah, somehow we have to continually, lovingly, with humility, infuse that back into whatever new religious systems we're creating for now and for the future coming up.
Well, part of the conversation too that I think is a part of what happens when we build these frameworks around consent is that it really gives us a lot of freedom to be able to say, well, that's not the God that I know.
Yeah.
And if that's the type of God that you have, I don't want it.
Right.
I was just recently in a Bible study with some fellow clergy, and we were reflecting on one of the miracles in Mark, one of the healings in Mark. And I shared, we were talking about what does it mean in this context of healing, and how the healing was done on the Sabbath, and what does that mean, and how does that relate to church law, and but also how does it relate to healing and liberation and restoration, and they were having interesting comments, but I had spoken up and I said, well, as the person who is oftentimes the one on the opposite end of the table being negotiated, I would like to point out that I think that there is something to this conversation that is inherently unbalanced or unjust, because it's still a question of, well, we're the ones who get to decide the power system. So who is it? Where are we going to draw the line? Or to use the phrase that they were using, where are the boundaries to our love? And I said, well, I think you're getting boundary and barrier confused,
Mm-hmm.
because what you're saying sounds much more like a barrier and not a boundary.
Mm,
It sounds much more like a field trip and not an adventure.
mhm,
And so, I said to them, I feel very comfortable writing that God off, and I feel like I have every sacred right to do so, um, because that's
right.
not the God that I have experienced on the journey, on the adventure. And I often say, we talked about the God who's on the mountaintop, who is really wonderful, and we have the existential ecstasies. And then we also have the God who's on the valley, who is the God that we encounter when we're suffering. Um, but I'm much more in favor of the God of the climb, the God who picks up their backpack with us and climbs the mountain with us and gets sweaty with us and needs to take a rest stop with us. And because that seems like a more relatable God, a more accessible God. And it's also a God who's willing to break a sweat with us, to take risks with us. And so all that being said is I hear a lot of that and I feel a lot of that with your book on this theology of consent. And can you particularly, for our viewers, talk a bit about mimetic theory, Rene Girard, and um, how you use that as a mechanism for distilling this idea of open and relational theology?
Yeah, well, so initially, mimetic theory and open and relational theology, they aren't really answering the same questions. They're kind of two different paradigms. They're two different, really large, um, venerable, big concepts that some people have spent their lifetimes trying to wrap their brain around. Um, and they're different kind of approaches. Mimetic theory is more anthropological, more psychological, more kind of specific, how humans have developed. Open and relational is a more broader metaphysical, and kind of has implications in wider areas. So it was very interesting because at times I used mimesis to unpack ORT. At other times I used ORT to unpack mimesis. Um, but to answer your question, Rene Girard was a French anthropologist who lived, well, he died in 2015, so he's rather contemporary. Um, and he began to really, through his work as a literary critic, he began to see what some of the more famous, interesting, intriguing novelists of our history have done with certain characters around desire and around the ways that desire is influenced by the other, again because it's a relational cosmos, although he doesn't use that phrase necessarily. And so that began to unpack some stuff for him, and he was like, oh, I'm seeing how Proust or Shakespeare or Dostoevsky is creating these characters, and I think there's some truth in real life. And then at the same time, or roughly speaking the same time, he's unearthing, so to speak, different what different tribes and different ethnicities and people groups have done around the world throughout time. And he's matching up kind of the way that they lived their life and ordered their systems and their world, so to speak, their little world, around a particular way that matched up with what the novelists were saying. And then kind of at the same time, this is one way of saying it, Girard kind of begins to remember his Catholic Christian roots and in the Hebrew stories in general that are, once you kind of see the way that the Hebrew prophets are pointing out the scapegoating mechanism, you realize, oh gosh, there's something substantive here. And so all these three things are kind of pinging across his radar. And so then he kind of creates this idea of mimetic theory, which is all about, well, that's a whole nother part of the discussion. I can unpack that if you want, but and it can be unpacked in a lot of different ways. At this point, I've done it many times, so I can do it fairly quickly. But yeah, that began to have implications for me initially because I was trying to wrestle with essentially why I thought bad things had to happen, and then I was like, well, why does bad stuff had to happen to Jesus? Why did Jesus have to die? I decided that Jesus didn't have to die because God needed him to. Well, what else was going on? Girard's mimetic theory and the scapegoating mechanism gave me a reasonably intelligent way to then read not just the Jesus story, but then the entire Bible and then my entire basically religious upbringing, and to see how that all influenced it. And basically the long and short of that is that Jesus had to die because we killed him. This is what we do. We've ordered our world around scapegoating violence. And if you don't fit in, if you're the anomaly, if you're the person sitting at the other end of the table, like you just said, sooner or later you will get scapegoated. Hopefully not hung on a tree, but you'll get pushed out of the group. So it's this kind of ancient mythic way that we've ordered ourselves, and Jesus subverts all of it. And so Girard, yeah, super important character.
Yeah, it reminds me of the inherent nature within our system that anything that's different is suspect, and that we oftentimes lead with suspicion rather than leading with curiosity.
Yeah.
We don't seek clarification, we seek accusation, right?
Right.
And so can you unpack for us, as you just mentioned, this whole
Yeah.
idea of mimetic theory?
Yeah.
And
I
maybe
can.
give us an example.
Right. So what I usually do, first of all, it's laughable to try to do this in 5 or 10 minutes, because this is someone who was infinitely more intelligent than me and spent his lifetime, and others have spent their lifetime, unpacking his work. But I'll unpack it. The way I usually say it in a shorter discussion like this is I see mimetic theory as kind of a fivefold movement that takes place against the backdrop of two things. Two things. One of them is, we've already talked about, is that everything's relational. So, nothing happens in a vacuum. I personally don't think there is an ex nihilo. I think there's always something in relation to something else. And so our whether it's biology or anthropology or psychology, spirituality, whatever we're talking about. In Girard's case, it's basically psychology, psychodynamics, and it has to do with desire. So the backdrop against which it plays out against is relationality. And then the second piece is the fact that you just kind of mentioned it when you talked about accusation. I think that's the word you used. But it's this idea that what seems to be true about all of us humans, a common denominator, maybe is a better way to say it, is that we all recognize that something's not quite right, and we feel a bit insecure about it and a bit anxious. And in philosophical language, we'd call it lack. And so Girard, who himself isn't born out of a vacuum. He comes from Freudian, Lacanian, Hegelian kind of thinking, which would say there is no such thing as a non-lacking subject. So all subjects, all of us have an element of lack, of insecurity. So you got that relational piece and that insecurity piece. And then against that backdrop, the fivefold movement, I'll just say the five things and then I'll briefly unpack them. It's desire that leads to imitation, that leads to conflict, and then to scapegoating. And then the fifth piece, which is the re-sequencing all of it, which leads to religion. So desire, we've kind of already said, none of us really have any desires of our own. My desires are built on the desires of the other person. Our marketing people are the people who know this the best. They won't show me a pair of jeans that I want to wear. They're going to show me a pair of jeans that my model pretends like they want to wear. And so I'm influenced by my model. In particular, I'm influenced by the fact that he's usually a little bit better looking than me. He's a little bit more put together. It appears that he's someone who does not have lack. Like, that's the thing that the advertisers are going for. If they can show us people who seem to kind of have it put together and have the answers. And so I begin to imitate those desires. And so maybe in this example I just mentioned, there's a pair of jeans. I buy the jeans. Well, what's interesting is, among other things, is our model is always a subject themselves. So that model who's wearing the jeans may go home at night or in some way figure out that people are paying attention to those jeans, and then now becomes someone who wants the genes all the more because someone else has become his model. And so it serves to drive the value of the genes up. And of course, by genes, the listener should know that could be anything. It could be a degree, it could be the girl or the guy, it could be a political position or anything, right? But so it drives the value of the genes up, but it also seems to drive our own conflict and insecurity up because we all know that there's no amount of genes that can fill the lack inside. There's no amount of that thing, whatever that thing is. And so for Girard, the desire leads to imitation. That always leads to some kind of conflict. We're feeling conflictual about this. We're like participating in this thing that we think is the remedy, and it's really kind of the poison at the same time. Though in a second it'll become the remedy again. So it's like desire, imitation leads to conflict, and then the fourth piece is scapegoating, which is the thing that Girard is most well known for. It's obviously not a term that is 100% original with Girard. I mean, it comes from the Hebrew text. But the idea here is that as my conflict grows, sooner or later, it'll grow between me and my model. And it's never just me and that other person. My model and I both have communities attached to us. So it's always various numbers of people attached are coming into this together. And so now the conflict of the entire community is getting higher and higher and more intense. And what Girard discovered through the novelist, through his anthropological work and archaeological work, though he wasn't an archaeologist, but and through the Hebrew text, was that at the edge of the precipice, when the community is, going at each other's throat, and pointing at each other and blaming each other, that something happens. It's quasi-mysterious. It's some kind of psychological transference thing that we could get off into if we want to talk about. But basically what happens is the parties involved pointing their fingers at each other turn at the last moment and agree to blame someone else. So they begin to point their finger at someone else. And then I call it a psycho-spiritual move. Like there's this transference of it's more than just blame. It's like, oh no, that person over there is responsible for my insecurity and my lack and my conflict. And then once we see our problems on the back of another person, it becomes infinitely easier for us to justify our punishing of the other person. And then we, throw them in the volcano, we lynch them on the tree, we push them in the gas oven, we don't sit with them at the lunchroom table, we write bad things about them on Facebook, on and on and on. The list is endless of the ways that we scapegoat them. And it's always built on two lies, at least two lies. One is that that myself and the model are innocent, because what happens is I come together with my former adversary and we gain a sense of unity. There's power. There's so much power in all of that. And you might see that. You ask for examples. I mean, this is kind of our entire political system. It feels like at this point, and maybe it's always been this way, but it certainly feels like by now it's all built upon this. Like, how do I point out certain victims in order to align myself with others to build unity so that we can have this power? So it's built on two lies. One, that me and my adversary are innocent, and number two, that the victim is guilty. In reality, most of the time, it's like completely the opposite. So we scapegoat. And what's fascinating about the scapegoating thing is that it kind of works. It's like catharsis is probably the best word to use. Like there's something that sweeps through the community when they're at the edge of violence and they all decide, or we all decide, because I'm implicated in all this too, when we all decide to put our dysfunctional garbage on the back of others and get rid of them. For a time being, it does seem to kind of work, and the communities are, they're going to experience some sense of peace, but it'll always build back up again because it's a fake peace. It's not a real thing, because violence can drive out violence, but only for a little while, which I think, is side note, is a way to get at Jesus's famous thing about, can Satan drive out Satan? According to Mimetic Theory, kind of yes, but only for a little while. And then it builds back up. And essentially the fifth piece is that it's it's the repeat of everything, because what happens is when the tension builds back up, the community goes, in so many words, goes, well, what did we do last time to help us gain peace? Um, oh, I remember we projected all of our stuff onto someone else and we blamed them. And so let's do that again. And then over time, what Girard says is that we added essentially liturgy to that, and songs and prayers and symbol and ceremony. And so that the last thing I'll say is that for Girard, religion doesn't inspire violence as much as violence has inspired religion. Because if we could just go all the way back to those first things I said about relationality and about insecurity, and just live with the insecurity instead of creating this entire system, of violence to deal with our insecurity, you know, we maybe have a chance at a healthy kind of religion, but we haven't done that in the West and probably all over the world. And so that fifth piece is really, really important. It's like and interesting how we keep doing it over and over again. So that's a scandalously quick way of, and my apologies to any Girardians who are listening. There's a lot of nuance to all that, but that's kind of what I'm unpacking in Theology of Consent, and I think it's a kind of an interesting way to look at mimetic theory.
Well, I think it's fabulous. I think it's a wonderful mechanism, and I really enjoy the book. And one of the things that I
Thank you.
think manifested for me when I was reading it, and even as we're talking and you explain through things, is I think it's you mentioned the word lack, and I think that's really important because in a lot of ways, when we boil our, when we sieve our religion and we boil everything down, it ultimately becomes the awareness that we have built up these religious systems as a way to hide this insecurity, and to hide this belief, this deeply held belief that has been reinforced within all of us through our religions, that we have lack, that we are lacking inherently, and that we are inherently unworthy, that we're worthless. And at best, God just tolerates us, but at worst, God really despises us. And when it comes to the whole scapegoating thing, I think we oftentimes sanctify the scapegoater, the one who is pointing at the one who's like, this person is the bad one. And because that person is calling that person bad, they certainly become the sacred one that we worship and become our savior, so to speak. And it's almost like pointing to the moon, and we worship the person who points at the moon instead of worshiping the moon, right? And all of that is because we allow ourselves to believe this false belief of the self, that the self is inherently worthless or lacking, which is not biblical. Because if we look at Genesis 1, which a lot of us have just ripped out of our Bibles and thrown away, when God created creation, God said it was good. And when God created other sentient beings, God said it was very good. This is why Aquinas in his Summa talked about all of us are originally good, that we're all born into original goodness. Matthew Fox later coined the term original blessing, which is thus a theological term for goodness. So I think this idea of really confronting that, interrogating it, and trying to heal it by saying, no, within all of us there's this inherent longing for a truth that is really true. The truth that our soul knows to be true. Because I often tell people our souls and our selves know the same thing. It knows that we are good. It knows that we are great, that we are good, holy, and beautiful. And if we can give into that desire that knows that to be true, and brings us and drags us into living that out in our day-to-day life, it really changes and transforms our theologies and what it means to be religious people or spiritual beings, right? I'm a big fan in philosophy of the school of philosophy called absurdism, which has people like Albert Camus in it, and existential psychologists like Rollo May, who all believe that the world or life is inherently absurd and it lacks meaning. And because of that, we can create meaningfulness by showing up and dabbling and following that desire, right? And questioning and challenging that false belief of one unworthiness. So I really think that this book is very helpful for reclaiming that inherent desire for wholeness. In the book that Tom co-edited with a few other people partnering with God, I wrote an essay in that book around the sacraments as tools for cooperating with God, and how I like to think of the sacraments as God being our best friend who's with us at a party, and then all of a sudden their favorite song comes on the speakers, the DJ plays their favorite song, and they get all excited and they grab you by the arm and pull you onto the dance floor and ask you to dance with them under the spotlight. I think that's the kind of radical obsession that God has for us, and that that internal desire for that. If we learn to take all that silly unworthiness off of it and unwrap it a little bit and follow that desire, we end up in a place where we discover that God is radically obsessed with us, who doesn't tolerate us, who doesn't despise us, but who wants to dance with us, who wants to make love with us, who wants to be in this cooperating partnership with us. And maybe who doesn't have answers for us, but who has better questions for us. And so I appreciate this book. I appreciate the work that you've done on it, and I'm glad you're doing it in the world. I think it really is helpful for us as we continue to dialogue about the world that's coming just beyond the horizon. As we wrap up, share with some folks your final thoughts about this book, about these ideas. Where do you feel like you're being drawn as you follow that desire currently? And where can people find you all over the internet?
Yeah, well, where am I being drawn according to that desire? So if the idea is accurate, which I think it is, that desires are born out of our relationship with others and with God, then it's really important to have, or it's really significant to consider who are the people in your life, who are those models, and who are you being influenced by? And so, yeah, I'm influenced by other authors and other creative types, podcasters like yourself, and artists and people who are continually wrestling with these more difficult questions that they're at the edge of complexity. I don't need to go full on anarchy chaos. Although some days I'm like, maybe it'd be better. But like just trying to live on the edge of complexity where there's enough disturbance to create something new, but also enough order to continually to, systematize things so that you can live there. I'm very interested in that. I continue to write. I wrote, my most recent book is called Indigo, the Color of Grief. And it's a work that is probably the best thing I've ever written, and it seems to be getting more traction than anything else I've written. So people can check that out. And the other book that we talked about today at jonathanfosteronline.com is the easiest way. Up until a couple weeks ago, you could have found me on Facebook, but apparently I'm suspended permanently. That's what the meta gods are telling me. It's just crazy. I'm not even, I don't, we're still trying to figure out what happened. Have no idea. But yeah, jonathanfosteronline.com is probably the easiest way. And then maybe people can jump on my Substack newsletter or whatever. But I would love to interact with folks. It'd be great.
Absolutely, yeah. And all those links will be in the description below for people to sign up and get a copy of the book. I highly recommend it. It's again, The Theology of Consent. This is the cover of it. I love this infinity with the heart. I think that's very clever. It also looks like a fish. I don't know if that was intended or not. I think this is wonderful. I appreciate your presence in the world and all the work that you're doing. I'm glad you came on the show to share with people these ideas. I think it's very life-giving and refreshing to hear a theologian talk about these ideas, since you're not going to hear this kind of stuff in a pulpit on Sunday
Mm,
morning, unless you come to my church, in which case you
right,
will.
right. Well, you used to hear it at my church, but then the whole system got rid of me. So yeah, it's hard to find.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, dear friends, remember that in all things, life is short, and we do not have much time. To gladden the hearts of those who journey with us, to be swift to love, make haste to be kind. And this day and every day, do not shy away from dancing the dance of freedom. And the blessing of the God who is the God of peace, the nonviolent Christ, and the liberating Spirit be with you this day and forevermore. Amen.